are with the University of Karate, and today we have a special series of historical reminiscings, looking back, that we're going to begin. We don't know how many episodes that we'll have, but we believe it's going to be a very insightful look at the University of Karate, who we are, what we are, and a historical fact and figure that you need to know. Take a look at your screen right now. The Oakdale Christmas House, for almost 50 years, had one of the most famous Christmas light displays in the once sleepy town of St. Petersburg, Florida, maybe all of Florida. This gray-haired little old man has been running the light display all these years, both to delight area children and to share his Christian faith. Yet what if I told you that this once sleepy retirement town of St. Petersburg was at one time the headquarters for the largest karate tournament in the country, founded by a martial arts expert, a black belt in multiple styles, a gifted independent researcher on the history of martial arts, and author of possibly the first encyclopedia of karate and related arts, a over 1,000-page volume. And that martial arts master and pioneer is the same gray-haired little old man with the kind smile and bright eyes on your screen now. Find it hard to believe? Sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. Sensei Biddle, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so this is sort of who we are. You know, we use the name University of Karate, and that was by design. John came to me a few years ago, and we've been talking, and he came about a year ago. He said we should put some of this stuff down on YouTube to create a library, to create an archive, because a lot of this knowledge is gone, going away. So would you mind creating this library, these videos? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. That sounds exciting. So the University of Karate is reborn. And it is a blast from the past, and that's who we are. And that man,
Take a moment.
So, the man in that picture that we're referring to is Ted Kresge. And if you know, you know. If you don't, you should. Ted Kresge is arguably, or was arguably, one of the most influential martial artists in the country in the 70s and early 80s. And as John mentioned, he put on one of the largest karate tournament, the United States Open of its time. He wrote the Encyclopedia of Karate and Related Arts, over 1,000-page book, and had multiple schools, went all over the country in organizing these tournaments, and we'll go into more of that detail later. But Ted Kresge was my teacher.
Take your time. I know it's emotional for you because he was your teacher.
He did a lot for me and changed my life. And the principles and the things he taught made me who I am. And that's why we want to tell the history and the story, because it should be known, it should be told. And as far as who I am, and this sort of a piece of this, is I was the inheritor of his art when he retired. When he retired and stepped away, and we'll go into some of that. There's a lot of things in this history that people don't know, that have been rumored, that have been misunderstood, misexpressed, besmirched, and all these things, and that's kind of the reason for this story, is to tell the tale. So when he retired, he called me up and invited me down to his house, me and my wife, and told me he was stepping away, and that he asked me to take over his schools. We had 6 of them at the time. At one time we had 9, and I ran those schools for a number of years, and that's where that is in what the University of Karate is. and where we are today. That's why we're still the University of Karate. We're carrying on his tradition. He was a pioneer of information, promotion, and like I said, nobody rivals him in that period of time in the scope. And anybody that was in the martial arts that was a who's who knew Ted Kresge. So that was why we wanted to tell this story, because it's history. It's part of our mission statement. And it's what he would do. So I'm going to turn it back over to John. We're sort of flip-flopping on this video because I want, John's going to do a little bit of the historical side of it and talk to us a little bit about who Ted was and where he came from, that sort of thing, and just give you guys a little bit of background so you can understand this key player in the martial arts.
We started out saying that fact is sometimes stranger than fiction. And again, we have to look at the facts because there's some special insights that you would have, or anyone would have, if they have a copy of his book or know people that knew him. He was a very, very gifted individual. And in his book, it talks a little bit. The publisher made him, because he was very, very private, the publisher made him put some kind of biography. I'm not sure who made it, but it talks a little bit of his history because he was a military man that retired in St. Petersburg, Florida, and opened a number of schools, of which we're talking now. Let me read a little bit from the book Encyclopedia of Karate and Related Arts, where it talked about who Ted Kresge is. It says, Ted Kresge has studied several different types of karate, including Chinese boxing, sometimes referred to in the United States as Kung Fu. He was first introduced to the martial arts in 1957, and since that time, he has also studied Judo, Aikido, and fencing. He began teaching karate in Orleans, France in 1962 while still in the military. In 1963, he began teaching in Germany. In 1964, Mr. Kresge had one of the largest armed forces judo clubs in Europe or the United States. In 1965, Mr. Kresge established the Fort Bragg Karate Club, as well as the Sanford, North Carolina Matson Academy of Karate. So he was connected with George Matson from that time. Mr. Kresge instructed airborne and special forces at Fort Bragg in 1965 and 1966. Let me repeat that. He was a teacher for the airborne and special forces at Fort Bragg in 1965 and 1966. We should end the video right there. Go ahead.
I could testify to some of those techniques because he did show some of those stuff that was taught back then.
So you don't get to teach the special forces at Fort Bragg unless you are something to be, reckoned with. But I'll continue. In 1966, Mr. Kresge established the NATO Karate Club outside of Paris, France. And in 1967, this club was moved to Mons, Belgium. His students have spread out all over the world, and there are now about 18 clubs in Europe. This is written in 1971. There was 18 clubs in 1971 as a result of Mr. Kresge's teaching. He is a tremendous and was a tremendous researcher. His research into the martial arts for the book that we're reading from took 14 years of research, and he cataloged the history of Chinese boxing and karate dating back from over 2,000 years ago with a fantastic degree of accuracy. And now you can look at that book and see it. Now, of course, this book is a collector's item. Very few people have it. We may talk a little bit more about what we're planning to do with that later on. But he had a library of over 1,500 books that were in 10 different languages that dated all the way back to the 1820. This was a tremendous, tremendous individual. And again, Sensei Biddle jumped in a little bit, but Sensei Biddle was a student of his, maybe even we would say his last student. He inherited, or the school was passed on to him when Mr. Kresge retired. But he saw him, trained with him. Now, again, of course, it may seem like a silly question, but this man was a student of karate, kung fu, judo. He was a high-ranking judo teacher and black belt. Question: Was he really that good?
That's an understatement.
Has to be asked.
Yeah, he did those things. He was those things. I've never seen a human being that could do some of the things that he could do. He would teach judo classes, and that was what was cool about the University of Karate, because that's what it was. He taught history. He taught some of this stuff out of this book. There was times we sat down and he'd read out of the book. There's times he would bring out stuff, and then we would do, we're doing a judo class today, and we would do throws and grappling, and then we do ground fighting. So this is going on. I was around around 79 and through the early 80s with him. This is going on all the time. Everybody talks about all this stuff, judo and grappling and stuff. We were doing it because that's what he did. I learned how to do an arm bar before I was a brown belt. And we would do these judo throws, and then he would come in and we'd go, okay, we're going to do Tai Chi today. And we'd practice Tai Chi. He would explain the concepts of it. So all these things and different styles of karate that he knew. When he sparred, he often sparred not like I would be now out of a Sanshin stance, but he'd spar out of a horse stance where he would he'd face sideways, one arm up, one arm down, and he would hit you with a side kick that you never saw coming. I mean, he had all the kicks, jump spinning kicks, side kicks, round kicks. His back fist was blinding fast. You did not get hit with that back fist. Nobody ever blocked it. And nobody ever blocked his side kick. There was only one human being that Ted testified to that ever blocked it, and that was Master James Thompson. And I have had an opportunity to ask Master Thompson about that, and he said, yeah, I remember that. So, yes, this was a man that did what is being said there and practiced it and demonstrated it to us. Nobody that went to school had any doubt that he had the abilities and the capabilities and things that he did. And the things he did, he even had internal art knowledge, all, things that go on and on and on. That's why a lot of the stuff that I have, I take back from a lot of things we do. And he imbued into me the same desire to learn and to do these things. So, yes.
It's said that he, and again, this is maybe the fourth time we're saying it, he, of all the things he did in all the different places he was stationed during his military career, he was at Fort Bragg training special forces. You have to kind of take that in of what type of ability he had in these various different arts to be not only considered for, but selected and hold that for a number of years. There's a lot of martial artists in the military, in the army at that time. But for him to be involved in training special forces really says something. Also, he was not just in the army, he was in the Signal Corps. Now, most people that aren't in the military or weren't in the military back in those days, in the 50s and 60s and 70s and so on, they may not understand what the Signals Corps is. But Signals is talking about radio, maybe television to some degree, shortwave, any type of communications. Their job was to both transmit as well as capture signals. The intelligence agencies, the NSA of its day, if you want to call it that, the spies and the people that were doing they relied upon Signal Corps to be able to capture information. These individuals had to have a knowledge of mathematics, physics, engineering, how radio waves work. These were people that had a very high aptitude. Ted Kresge could not have been in Signals Corps and not be a high aptitude person. I mean, look at his ability to create these books and to manage all these different types of enterprise he did. It was because he was a very high IQ person that was operating here. Again, Signal Corps was kind of like what we look at as cybersecurity today of that time. He was a very high aptitude person. And when you look at his ability to kind of gather and synthesize all these different martial arts, it really brings that together of who we're dealing with. Because he seems so zealous and also so kind-hearted, sometimes people might have mistook his meekness for weakness. But unfortunately, I hope they never found out that he wasn't as weak as they thought he was. But again, he had the ability mentally and physically to back up what he was talking about. He studied martial arts, as we said, these numerous martial arts, before he ran across a style called Uechi Ryu. In the late 50s, George Mattson wrote a book, almost the first book by an American on karate, called The Way of Karate. And he talked about Uechi Ryu. Now, the second book that was written by an American was by Robert Trias, who again is one of the pioneers of karate in America that many people don't know about. Some people call him the George Washington of karate in America. Started the first karate school in America, trained in the Solomon Islands during his military career. We can go on and on about Robert Trias. We'll talk to him later in our series. But Ted Kresge ran across Uechi Ryu and was captivated by this style and the interesting connection of karate and kung fu. At that time, George Mattson, being a trendsetter, had a program where you could do distance learning. He had 8mm films where he had the various kata and exercises and bunkai and so on outlined, and people could purchase those films, look at those films, and train, and they were to take a 8mm copy or film of them demonstrating the form, send it back into Boston for him to review so that they could be tested. So it was like a distance learning thing. Sensei Kresge was a part of this program, and more than likely in the mid-60s or somewhere around there, maybe late 50s, early 60s, he was a part of that and took military leave to go to Boston to test for rank when he went through this series. This is where he got his black belt. Sensei Mattson said it was a provisional or, maybe a black belt based upon the film, but he received his black belt through George Mattson by going to Boston and testing. As a result of that, he came to St. Petersburg, started opening schools, and started opening even a special way for his students to exercise and train, which was a karate tournament. I think it was called the East Coast Nationals first. And this became one of the largest tournaments in the country. Now, before I even read something about that, Sensei Biddle attended some of these tournaments. What did you see at these tournaments, Sensei Biddle? Who did you see?
Wow. So the U.S. Open was the first one I went to in 1979, and it was packed. I mean, there was people, you can't even imagine how many people were there. And the who's who in karate were there. And I'm going to list off some names. Now, some of these may have occurred in a couple of tournaments later on, but I'm just going to give you a list of some of the names that I know and whom I met, who I saw, and who came to this tournament, because you have to understand what this was. This stuff like nothing has ever been done. So here's a couple of names. So Chuck Merriman was there. Heidi Ochai, who was one of the Japanese practitioners. You can look him up. Read about Heidi Ochai. I met Heidi Ochai. His kata was amazing. And then there was Ernie Reyes Jr. was there. His son became Ernie Reyes Jr., Ernie Reyes Sr. was there. His son, Ernie Reyes Jr., became one of the Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. His son was a baby at the time, and I remember Ernie Reyes telling how he was teaching him to break eggs. We had, and then there's all kinds of, John Chung was there, one of the Korean martial artists, he did one of the most amazing katas I've ever seen, and he was a national champion, maybe even world champion. He was there. And if you know this name, you should, Jun Ri, the Korean practitioner who invented safety equipment. The man who invented the safety equipment that you put on your hands, the pads, the traditional karate pads. Jun Ri came to Ted Kresge's tournament. There was Karen Shepard. She was a female kung fu artist, martial artist who went on to star in movies. Don the Dragon Wilson, who was a professional fighter who also made movies. Cynthia Rothrock. Look her up. She made numerous movies, probably made more, she was a female that made more karate movies than anybody else. These were all people who were there, and I know I'm forgetting names. I'd have to go, remember some of the stuff. But these people were just walking around in this tournament, and then they would do, some of them compete, some of them were there to help with the rules and things, and then in the evenings we would do shows. And we would, Walt Bone did his kata factory. And if you know, you know, right? He had a kata team that he went all over the country, and he was Floridian. At the time, Ted Kresge and Walt Bone were the two biggest, basically only schools in this area, in Tampa, Florida area. And he would always come to the tournament, and he'd put on his demonstration, the kata factory. We had weapons experts that came over from all over the world. I saw some of the best sword kata I've ever seen. Broad Chinese sword, nunchuck, Glenn Premu, a name that probably nobody remembers. I can't even find him anymore. He did nunchuck kata and kama kata that were blurs. So James Sisko was the one who won the fighting that year. Keith Vitale came to the tournament. Keith Vitale. These are the guys, when I was in karate and I'd get Black Belt magazine out and I'd be going through it, I'm like, I saw that guy. These were the contributors. These were the who's who. These were the people that were they're in the magazines, and he knew them. And what he used to do to go, when he was getting ready to do this tournament, he would take off, him and his wife, and they'd get in a little VW bug, and they'd load it up with Coca-Cola, bread, peanut butter, and jelly, and they'd go on the road for a month. And they would go all over the country, visiting all these preeminent schools and inviting them to come to the tournament. Because you didn't have email, and you didn't always have phones. It was hard. So he went on the road. So he personally presented himself. Chuck Merriman, will you come to my tournament? Yes, Ted, I'll be there. June Rhee, yes, I'll be there. I mean, can you imagine? This was happening in St. Pete. And when you see these tournaments, these competitions, it was mind-boggling. And I'll pass it back to John because he's got something he wants to possibly read about what was said about that tournament.
Yeah, because when you look at the idea, and then for some people that may know some of these names, some people have to look them up. Some of their younger friends out there may have to look some of these names up. You have to ask yourself, how is it that he knew all these people who knew him, but I don't know about Ted Kresge? Well, that's the reason why we're doing this video. Because, again, there's a story here. And for those that may say, well, was it really that big a tournament? I never heard of it. I'm going to read something here from the St. Pete Times, taken back. This is probably back in the late 70s, early 80s. The St. Pete Times is now called the Tampa Bay Times, one of the most decorated newspapers in the Southeast, even in the country. This is a major newspaper. And when you talk about fact checking, these newspapers check their facts. Let me just read a little paragraph or two from the St. Pete Times about the tournament that was eventually termed the U.S. Open Karate Tournament by Ted Kresge before he sold it in the early 80s. It says this, I'm quoting, The scene resembled Times Square on New Year's Eve at Eckerd College Saturday as nearly 1,500 competitors, not the attendees, 1,500 competitors, some of them local entries, but most of them coming from places as distant as London, Tokyo, and Mason, Iowa, and even a larger number of spectators crammed into Eckerd's gym for the U.S. Open Karate Tournament or Karate Championships. The U.S. Open is the biggest karate tournament in the United States and one of the 3 biggest in the world. And it is number 1 in terms of the hoopla surrounding the event. Now, this is the newspaper saying this, verifying this. This is fact. Now, again, if you don't know who Chuck Merriman, go and type in Chuck Merriman on Google and see who he is. Some of you know who he is. But there's a quote here in this same article from the St. Pete Times from Chuck Merriman. It says this. It says almost all the competitors, this is the St. Pete Times before I read the quote, It says almost all the competitors, though, agreed that the Open or the U.S. Open ranks as the best run karate tournament in the country. Now, I'm quoting here. It says, "This is the biggest tournament I've ever been to and the most well run," said AAU head coach Chuck Merriman of Connecticut. Quote, "They do a hell of a job. I've been all over the world," added Merriman, "and I ain't seen nothing like it," unquote. Now, again, direct quote from Chuck Merriman. Do you think, for those that know who Chuck Merriman is, that he doesn't know what a tournament is, or has a scope of tournaments he's been all over the country to, and that he could not assess and say that this is the biggest tournament I've ever been to? Again, the facts sometimes are stranger than fiction. Here we see the U.S. Open Karate Tournament run by an individual that everyone knew, but you don't know who he is. He was trained in Uechi Ryu by 8mm film by George Mattson, would take military leave and go and study with George Mattson. And in the early days, his promotions for his belts and black belts and so on went through Boston to Okinawa. Now, this was the situation, and this is how this tournament expanded and grew to a number one situation in the sleepy town of St. Petersburg. Now, something that has to be added here as we kind of wind this up, because we have a number of different sections we'll break this into. We're almost at 30 minutes now. We wanted to do 15 minutes, but almost at 30 minutes now. Somewhere along the line, possibly when he went to one of these testings during his 8mm film study of Uechi Ryu, he got a hold of, or he was able to make a copy of, a film of Kanai Uechi doing the various kata. The same film that we usually play during these episodes. The Sanchin, the Seisan, all that. He had a copy of that. Now, he started studying this film, but he went and bought what was called back in those days a video editor, where he could actually take the film strip as it were, because most people, young people, they don't know what film strip is, and was able to crank it frame by frame to be able to break down and see frame by frame what the master was doing. When he started studying this frame by frame look at the techniques of Master Uechi, everything changes. Now the passion and zeal he has for Uechi Ryu is now intensified. It's like pouring gasoline on it, and he starts to see nuances and principles in the techniques he had never seen before. He starts to restudy and reanalyze and change all his techniques to as closely pattern after Kanai Uechi. In other words, at the beginning, through the 8mm film, he was a student of George Mattson when it came to Uechi Ryu. Now, because of this film with this video editor and is able to crank through these individual frames, now he becomes a student of Kanai Uechi. And the way that he practiced and deployed his Uechi Ryu techniques completely changes. Now, of course, some things started to happen that were a result of his zeal. He started doing a newsletter and sending out this newsletter all over the country to various people that he had this tremendous mailing list because of his tournament and his connection with various people. And he started outlining and explaining these wonderful principles that he started seeing in the form of Kanai Uechi. And he started to encourage people to study these things out. People would start flying into St. Petersburg, the sleepy town of St. Petersburg. They started flying in, taking vacations, and studying with Ted Kresge. As a result of this, a number of people started to test for black belt ratings. So people started going to Okinawa and getting ratings. People started to have a more advanced, if you want to say, understanding of some of the styles, nuance, and a better ability to actually perform them. And he got, let's say, some pushback from the leadership of Uechi Ryu in Boston. And he was summoned to come to Boston because of this. Everything changes at this point. We don't want to go deeply into that because that is a part of our part 2 in looking at this history of this style, this system, and also Ted Kresge. But we're going to end off with giving Sensei Biddle a few words to say as we close, as we leave it there and the progress of history. But why do you think this is important to kind of look at some of this history as we sign off?
It's important. History is always important because that's whether it's good or bad, there's lessons in it. All history is not good, but there's stories that need to be told because there's reasons for things that sometimes people don't understand, and we make judgments about, and it changes trajectories. And those trajectories have impacts that ripple through time. That trajectory, and we'll go into this, but that trajectory, that last couple of the last pieces John mentioned, that trajectory changed my path because it led me to what I know today about what I've studied and what I've learned. And Ted was the role model for me in that because he was inquisitive and intelligent and never stopped learning. He never stopped. He never quit. He always examined, how can we make this better? What is the right way to do this? And he didn't have a problem telling you that it was the right way, but he could back it. So that was my background, and his intelligence, as John spoke about, is off the charts. And because people don't know some of this, and because I've heard a lot of things over the years from different sources about what kind of martial arts he was, but if you weren't there, then you don't know. I was there. This man could look in the sky and tell you every star in the sky, every constellation, everything you could see. You get a telescope and point in the sky and he could tell you what it was. He could build race cars. He was a genius, and this is what you don't know if you didn't spend enough time with him. Typically, it's like, we've talked about this student-teacher relationship. I had a different relationship with Ted Kresge than most do. So I was on the inside of a lot of this. I understand a lot of the makeup of the human being, this man that shaped the martial arts. And it rippled through time. And I think in some way, everybody out there has had some benefit from Ted Kresge, whether you know it or not.
Well, we're going to leave it there because we have a more interesting continuation. Our second part is going to possibly look at the concept of dark clouds rising over St. Petersburg. Maybe that's what we'll title it as we go into this next chapter. Because again, there's a lot more twists, turns, and interesting happenings in this story of why this very influential, probably one of the most influential persons in the karate world in America during that time, you don't know about. Join us next time on the University of Karate for part 2, and we'll see you next time.